from Farron's latest and greatest, and that is, I've just forgotten the title. This is Pamela Burton, and you're listening to KPFK. Today, my special guests in the studio are here to help me talk about the issue that we have been talking about, that we've been covering for the last few weeks on this program, the issue of the war in the Middle East. And in some parts, of course, our psychological responses are very important, as many of us are even responding to those responses of other Americans, finding ourselves kind of dumbfounded at the fact that with the Yellow Ribbon campaign and all the cheering and hoopla about people coming back, of course, needless to say, people are thrilled to have our returning men and women safe. But the issue, of course, it has to be faced as to what we have done in terms of the Middle East and the devastation that continues, as we hear each day on the news, the devastation of Iraq, as we have completely destabilized this country. My guest today, two very interesting gentlemen on the subject of the war, and I know you've been very busy and you're going to be busy this week in Los Angeles talking to people about the war. Dennis Bernstein is here. He is a programmer from KPFK in Berkeley, and he's going to be speaking on Friday night. It's a fundraiser for KPFK. Also in studio with me is Dan Sheehan, who is also here for a couple of speaking engagements. Is there a reason why you both felt like a need to come and talk to people here in Los Angeles?
Well, Pam, we had been scheduled earlier to come into California. The Cristic Institute is going to be doing a weekend seminar at the Esalen Institute this Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and we were scheduled to come in to do that. And I've got to be in Los Angeles to talk with a number of people who are extremely concerned about the Iran-Contra matters. There are some television shows and movies that are being done about that. And so I was in consulting with some of the people, and we said, look, as long as we're coming in, we should come in to talk with people about things the Cristic Institute has been doing. And one of the things, of course, that we've been doing is reviewing the role of members of the enterprise, of Oliver North's enterprise, in supplying military equipment to Iraq, making promises to Iran back as early as 1985 that they would overthrow Saddam Hussein as part of the deal that was made with the Iranian government, which we now have the CIA transcripts of the conversations of Oliver North and Richard Secord and Albert Hakim with high Iranian representatives from October 29th of 1985 to that effect. We have lots of data about the covert operations that were underway against Saddam Hussein, working with Kuwait and the American Central Intelligence Agency, that played a major role in instigating Saddam Hussein to do the unfortunate things that he did. So there's a whole array of clandestine covert operations that the Cristic Institute has become quite expert in digging out and analyzing. And, of course, given the fact that we know the players, we have a tendency to know where to look for these people. And so we had decided that when we were going to be coming out to do some of these other more general discussions, that we would make ourselves available to answer questions and to talk with people. So I've got 3 different speeches planned here for tonight and tomorrow night and the following night in the Los Angeles area, so we can get to people in different sections of the city and communicate with them and answer some of their questions.
And I know, Dennis, you've been very concerned. You have a document. It's an incredible thing, and we want to hear so much more about this. We've only heard some bits and pieces, and it's only just begun to be picked up by the media in terms of a document that the Pacific News Service, you working with the Pacific News Service, have found out about plans. Danny's talking about plans for the future of what was going to happen in Iraq, and you've got some information about the plans that were made for Kuwait.
Well, some listeners to KPFK might have heard me talking earlier about this 200-page document prepared in November, December, and January by the 352nd Civil Affairs Command based in Saudi Arabia. This was a group of military planners who were preparing the recreation of post-war Kuwait. This document, as I said, was prepared. The preparation began in October. And there's so many amazing things about the document, but right now I feel like I'm in a twilight zone because everything that the document seems to plan is now coming true in Kuwait, and that's of great concern. And it's of great concern to me that when we first had the document and we tried to tell most of the mainstream press, like the Los Angeles Times, they had a different story on exactly what all this information meant. Clearly, by the way, we got two documents. We got a 200-page Pentagon document from confidential sources, and we got a 4-page pro-democracy document from the pro-democracy movement in exile, the Kuwaiti pro-democracy movement, a 4-page document in Arabic. And the combination of the two documents, what was happening in October, in terms of what the Emir of Kuwait was promising the pro-democracy movement while the Emir of Kuwait was conspiring with the United States government to reinstitute martial law in Kuwait, sort of demonstrates that war was preordained. The two documents combined are very troubling. What does the document say? Very briefly, it's why am I here? Why am I concerned? Why do I want to get the press to cover it? Well, it's a situation in which the United States unilaterally, this is not a UN plan. The United States unilaterally plans to reinstitute martial law in Kuwait. Well, now, while the Army Corps of Engineers has done nothing for the people in Kuwait who are starving on the street, they have just finished rebuilding the palace. They've put in gold tiles in the bathroom. They are, in fact, making a home for the Emir of Kuwait. This is a document that says the United States government is going to run Kuwait for 3 months under martial law, if not for a year. It says that the United States could be in Kuwait for 5 years, if not longer, forever. We don't know. It's a document that talks about how the U.S. government is going to help institute not only martial law, not only total press censorship, but how they're going to, among other things, change the banking system to disenfranchise 2/3 of the population, which were Palestinian and other workers in the country before the war broke out. It says that they're going to change the banking system because, quote, now does this sound familiar to you, Danny? Because the Palestinians controlled the banks. So they're going to take the money away from the Palestinians and put it in the minorities' hands so that the Palestinians don't control the banks in Kuwait. I am concerned that it talks about roundups, ID cards, prison camps, so on and so forth. I'm concerned that this information is going to go under the rug, and that what's going to happen is that, as the Los Angeles Times played it when we gave them the document, that the United States government is the benevolent country coming in to help the people of Kuwait. And I'm very concerned about that, and I'm here to try and get the information out on that, and the fact that these roundups, as was predicted by the document in Pacific News Service, these roundups are going to continue. The tortures are going to continue. We now have reports of people being summarily shot, tortured, having their fingernails pulled out, all under the supervision, as per the document of the United States government. So I want to talk about that with the people in Los Angeles.
And much of what we get from mainstream media is so often, of course, one-sided, as I know you both have had dramatic experience with the idea of this one-sided nature. How might what we know now about this war fit within what has come to be called this George Bush's New World Order, something that was presented to us as if we should be proud as Americans that he has this New World Order for us all?
Well, there are, I think, two very serious dimensions to this New World Order, Pam. One is, of course, the domestic implications of the New World Order once it's understood, and the other one, of course, is the international scale and structure of the New World Order. When George Bush talks about the New World Order, he pretends that what he's really talking about is a new era of international cooperation under the auspices of the United Nations to try to enforce international law and standards of international conduct, diplomatic solutions to international disputes, and the ability of the international community to come together collectively to enforce the laws against those who would be lawless renegades, such as Saddam Hussein. Well, the fact is none of that comports with what, in fact, has actually transpired here, though there has been a great deal of effort to give it that kind of image. The fact is, as we recall, it was George Bush who unilaterally declared that he was going to send the U.S. military troops, 250,000, into Saudi Arabia. It wasn't the United Nations. The United Nations, on the 2 days after the invasion and then again 10 days after the invasion, passed specific diplomatic resolutions, making clear that they were seeking a diplomatic solution to this. Bush is the one that set up an alternative vision of how this was going to transpire. He is, in fact, the man who then sent 250,000 more troops in afterwards to transform what had been erstwhile Desert Shield into Desert Storm, into an offensive capability. He declared that he was going to send those troops into Iraq and throw them out, whether the United Nations did or did not authorize the use of violence and military power, because it was necessary to defend the United States' vital interests. This was a unilateral action. So the transparent hypocrisy between what George Bush actually did and the image he was attempting to project to the world of this being under this new, different kind of world order is quite frightening. So on the international level, you have to see that his idea of this new world order is not what he is actually professing. And then you need to ask what it is. And what he quite clearly is engaged in is an attempt to establish a major economic coalition among the United States, the new unified European economic community with a new reunified Germany standing astride Europe, and the Soviet Union. If in fact, primarily with certain sections of the Soviet Union, where the kind of European, Caucasian, Soviet citizenry under Gorbachev resides, and to allow to be spun off from the rest of the Soviet Union, the Slavic areas, the Mongolian areas, the others, and to establish an alliance with the White Russians. And you're looking at, therefore, a major coalition among what they refer to as the Northern Industrial States. And the whole idea is to have them unified under an international banking system of loans and extension of credit to the new Eastern Europe countries and to the Soviet Union, and to have them all participate in a major form of reconstruction, something akin to the Marshall Plan, to in fact establish a major economic alliance there that will be highly industrialized and then be able to turn in unison to the Southern Hemisphere, to the people of color who are not part of this Caucasian alliance, and look upon those people as possessing the resources, the strategic raw materials that are the grist of the mill, of the industrial mill of the Northern Hemisphere. And that type of dynamic is what they perceive as the New World Order.
And it's actually an old world order,
well,
really.
It's quite an old world order.
It's an old world order revised. And
exactly
what's
right.
interesting about the New World Order is that I agree with you, Danny, that all these countries and sort of Eastern Europe and all this will happen. But what's interesting and new and what George Bush has in mind is there's only one superpower now.
That's right. The military
and the New
arm
World
for that.
Order is going to be the U.S. dominating
That's right.
What goes on. Look, we didn't need any of the oil in Iraq or Kuwait, but the Germans did and the Japanese did. And so this is the United States government establishing a long-held geopolitical desire to establish a forward-fighting land base in the Middle East to essentially set up a toll booth between the United States and the new Germany, which they're terrified of, and the new Japan, which has sort of run us under the table on technology that's not military. So this New World Order is really an old world order with a new touch, which is the U.S. domination of it.
That's right. And in fact, Richard Armitage, a major player in the off-the-shelf enterprise, the man who in fact handled the delivery of the TOW missiles from the Pentagon to the enterprise to go to Iran under the Iran-Contra weapons deal, is announced publicly in a major article in the Washington Times in Washington, D.C., that, in fact, this New World Order is to be led by and under the supervision of the only true international world power, the United States. And he goes on then to begin to raise the issue of what the domestic implications are. He points out that the separation of powers in the Constitution of the United States are a concept that the Founding Fathers had when the United States was, as he says, anything but a major world power, that it was just a peripheral power on the coast of the Atlantic in the New World, and that at that time it may have been appropriate to have this separation of powers, to have, as he says, sections of the government set up at cross purposes with the executive. But the fact of the matter is, he says, that now this is very inefficient, and that his quote was that the executive branch now has every reason to bemoan the meddling in international policy of the Congress with the executive branch, and that he calls for a remodernizing look at the constitutional structures in the United States, and to call upon the Congress to stand down and stop meddling in foreign policy, and to allow the president to determine what is going to be the structure of this new world order, so that you begin to see the domestic implications. Anyone who attempts to interfere with what is perceived as this new rosy future of the United States standing astride militarily in being the police arm of this Northern Industrial Alliance, attempting to secure and protect their privileged access, as they put it, to the strategic raw materials that are needed to fuel this industry, both through the fuels of the oil industry and, of course, the raw materials of the Southern Hemisphere, of the copper and the bauxite and the other types of materials that are needed. This is what the New World Order looks like. And what they're moving to do is to adopt a strategy, as has been pointed out by Michael Clare from Hampshire College, who is the head of the inter-college kind of peace coalition there in Massachusetts. The whole point of his discussions and analysis are showing that the United States military in the Pentagon, all three branches of the military, and the intelligence community in the United States were petrified at the prospect of losing their major pulling oar in United States foreign policy development, i.e. militarist foreign policy, with the withdrawal of Gorbachev in mid-1989, in withdrawing of the Warsaw Pact from the 45-year Cold War.
And, of course, the peace dividend, which would have been
it would have come out of their pocket. It would have come out of their pocket.
In terms of the military-industrial research and development.
Right.
You know, this also seems to fit what, of course, was Reagan's era of deregulation. When you think about the ways in which they told us our rosy future was that if we deregulated things, and now as we move into the Bush era, he's, of course, talking about international
so
deregulation.
Now they're going to deregulate the Constitution.
With GATT. Well, with GATT, of course, we're also looking at the deregulation of the international banking industry, insurance industry, and worst of all things, of course, is the idea of the communications industry. And we know that when it's possible for anyone to control, as Ben Beck-Dickian has pointed out, with a less and less amount of people participating in the communications industry, we'll have less and less to get out. And I know I was just recently struck, Dennis, something you said about the way in which you had it responded to you. We at Pacifica had a suit going with a number of other people about the issue of the press and the fact that the press had a right to cover this war in a way that the White House did not want us to. And I think the remark by the press, the Los Angeles Times reporter about the courts, going back to this idea that we really don't have to worry so much anymore.
Well, I was in a debate here on one of the radio stations, one of the commercial radio stations, and I was on with Thomas Rosenstiel, who is a Washington correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, and I asked him on the air why the Los Angeles Times did not join the lawsuit that was brought by Pacifica and PNS and Mother Jones and The Nation and In These Times and The Guardian and this and that and the other thing. And I asked Mr. Rosenstiel, why was not the Los Angeles Times interested in suing the Pentagon to break open the censorship, the cut on censorship? And his response to me, amazing two-part response, was, first of all, I personally, Mr. Rosenstiel said, I don't personally feel it's the place of the press, you're going to love this, Danny, the place of the press to use the courts to do their job. We shouldn't involve the courts in our work. Now, I'm thinking as a journalist, I'm thinking about the Pentagon Papers 1, I'm thinking about all the gag orders that have been fought, all the lawsuits that have been brought against public officials who claim national security when really they're just covering their own butts, and on and on and on. And then he said, and also, as a person in the press, I feel that we should not report, or essentially what he said is that we have to pay attention to public opinion. i.e. press as God. Press does not determine it's a good story and put it out. The press has to find out how the public feels about hearing this information or that information. And that is extraordinary. Danny, what you were saying about domestic and international, I find very interesting because I've got this 200-page document, which is an outline, a blueprint for turning.
I think you were right the first time.
It's an outlawed. It's essentially a blueprint for turning Kuwait into a little mini South Africa, in the Middle East. It's a program for crushing the budding democracy movement that was growing in Kuwait right before Saddam invaded Kuwait. And it's it sort of legislates what's going to happen in Kuwait down to how many calories each Kuwaiti, not non-Kuwaiti, each Kuwaiti citizen is going to get. Well, if you look at that document, Danny, and then you take a look at the Bennett's drug white paper that came out maybe in 1989, I think it was, in which he talks about federal housing projects becoming little South African areas, Bantustans with ID cards and prison camps, right, which they've done. And then you hear reports about people, officers are showing up with ski masks on to arrest people. Why? Because they need this kind of protection because they can't be revealed to the drug dealers or they'll be in trouble, so they're doing arrests with ski masks on. And on and on and on. And you see that what they have in mind for the Kuwaitis, they have in mind for the people of this country. And we can see it coming out. This new world order coming home to the poor in this country. And this anti-crime bill is really an anti-poor bill.
Well, if any single lesson was learned, I think, from the Iran-Contra developments thus far, and there are a lot more to come, obviously. But I think that even with the limited insight that the institutions have gotten from the revelations in the Iran-Contra crisis, is that if you, in fact, allow to develop a certain set of principles and policies to operate on the international level, to undermine democracies, to carry out political assassinations, to overthrow other governments, to manipulate the news media in other countries, etc., if you create that type of a force outside of your country, those men are going to come back and exercise those exact same types of talents domestically when you try to interfere with their continued effectuation of those policies on an international level. And that's exactly what happened. That is the lesson of the Iran-Contra crisis, is that when you had these men in 1976 being publicly revealed in Senator Frank Church's Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse hearings, in Otis Pike's commission hearings on the House side, and they were condemned for the criminal covert operations of overthrowing domestically or democratically elected governments such as Arbenz in Guatemala, in Mossadegh in 1953 in Iran, etc., and on, Chile in 1973, Allende's government, that if you allow them to come to the conclusion that it's correct to overthrow democratically elected governments in foreign countries because they happen to be too liberal or too progressive or have different economic points of view, then obviously they become dedicated to that objective. And when the criminal nature of what they were doing was fully realized by the American people, and they took steps in 1976 to outlaw that type of conduct, and President Carter and Stansfield Turner ushered those men out of the government from 1976 to 1980, forced them into retirement, 820 men.
You mean those people working for the national security state, the CIA, et cetera, who would follow that kind of a policy?
Yes, those who were actually engaged in prosecuting that type of program internationally within the operational directorate of the Central Intelligence Agency, those men were turned upon. And they were condemned by the United States Congress, by a whole new generation of voters in the country, and turned out and were forced into retirement. And what they did is they then turned those talents against the domestic American political scene. They targeted 6 major United States senators, Senator Frank Church, who had chaired the Select Committee hearings, Senator Dick Clark of Iowa, who had sponsored the Clark Amendment, which outlawed criminal covert operations in Angola, against Senator McGovern, who had the audacity to run for president in opposition to these men. There were 6 of these men who were targeted, and millions of dollars was funneled in from the enterprise that was in banks outside of the country, Australia and Nugan and others, through South Africa into the United States, showing up mysteriously in these packs. And, for example, Senator Frank Church was attacked in Idaho, not because, on the face of it, because he opposed the criminal covert operations of the intelligence community, but instead, millions of dollars went into PACs attacking him for his position on gun control, attacking him for his position on the Equal Rights Amendment, attacking him for his position on publicly available birth control. And that's how he was attacked. And he was ousted from government. And those have been clearly shown. The Attorney General in Iowa, in Dick Clark's state, was impaneling a federal grand jury to look into that type of conduct by the intelligence community. Now, that's the kind of thing that every single political scientist has warned about, that if you set up a secret political police and you allow them to function, such as the KGB did, or the secret police, the Bureau of Special Services in South Africa, the SAVAK, the DINA, any of these groups, you allow them to conduct their activities outside of the country, and the minute that they disagree with what the American people or the majority of people in their country wants to do, they will turn their talents upon the domestic side. That is the shadow side of the New World Order.
And it's interesting to me, Danny, that ironically, one of the people who led the charge against those people as an aide to Senator Jeremiah Denton was Joel Lisker.
That's right.
And he shows up after he leads that charge. He shows up as an aide to the Iran-Contra committee.
The second chief investigator.
And the first we know is Tom Polgar, who was a former CIA station chief in Vietnam. Yeah. And it's so... I'm just not surprised anymore, although it's amazing that they can keep doing it. And if we take a look at these documents and what's going on now in Kuwait, the second part, or the second document about the pro-democracy movement, here you have the administration setting up, working with the emir, who is busy setting up death squads with hit lists in Kuwait. And so Ted Koppel is forced, because it's so public now, to put on the air a very prestigious businessman from Kuwait who comes on and says this. He says that the emir is back. They're creating death squads. There are now hit lists. And here, says Ted Koppel, is somebody who's paralyzed from the waist down, who says he's been shot by one of the emir's death squads. This is the same old thing. We do it abroad, and then we do it at home. Death squads there, repression here. The worse it gets there, the worse it gets here.
So what really needs to be done, however, I'd like to that having been set forth as the backdrop, I would like to point out to people that while they are feeling extraordinarily depressed in the face of this kind of litany of apparent successes, there's a lot of bad news and there's a lot of good news about what's going on here, because that. The American people, I think, in the midst of their celebrations tagged now Desert Rainbow, are in fact going to want to celebrate something good. They say, oh, gee, it's time for us to have something good here. We want to feel that we've been involved in a just war. We'd like to feel that we've done something good with our military, and so that there's almost a manic effort on the part of the American public to wrap themselves in a yellow ribbon and to become exultant about this thing. But just like in a trial that I do as a trial lawyer, the best part of the entire trial is when the other side puts on their very best witness. And after they get done testifying on their direct, the jury then almost believes them. Almost believes that what they're saying is true. And when they're shown to be complete liars and that they have undertaken to actively and consciously deceive the jury, the case is won. And that's what we see happening right now, because the fact of the matter is the image that George Bush has projected of what this war was all about, of how it started, of what it was all fought for, and all that is one huge lie. That the covert operations that were behind setting this war up, the plans that were hatched inside the Pentagon, where Kuwait and Saddam Hussein is directly named in internal documents beginning in January of 1990 all the way up to May of 1990 as a likely target for new covert operations on the part of the American Central Intelligence Agency to try to establish a new role for the intelligence community and for the United States military forces after the death of the Cold War. That what they need to do is to retool and to find a new target that they can use to justify to the American public that needs this massive military operation against them. That when they see that being done, when they find out about the details of what went on, like in any trial, they are going to be mortified. And to the exact degree to which they have been ecstatic, they will fall. And then they will be that much more furious because they have been betrayed by this man. And it's important for people to note that in 1972, in the November election of Richard Nixon, was the hugest political landslide in the entire history of American politics. And yet, within 2 years, the man was out. And he was disgraced. And he was impeached because of something he had done prior to the election.
All right, Danny, let me jump in here because I really want to ask you questions about hope and about what you're saying. Did you need to do an ID or something?
Yes, I did. Thank you very much, Dennis. I can tell you've been on the radio before. And I just want to let the audience know that we are speaking today with Dennis Bernstein, who is from KPFA and also a writer for Pacific News Service. He is in town to help KPFK raise some money on Friday night. More about that later. But also in studio is Dan Sheehan, and Dan Sheehan is the chief counsel for the Cristic Institute. You've heard an awful lot about the Cristic case here on KPFK in terms of the Lepenka bombing case. You've heard about some of the other cases that the Cristic Institute has been involved with. And why don't you go on? I want to make sure we get back to this issue, of course, what is going some of us thought that the end of the Cold War was going to see the beginning of the drug war, and that would be the way in which domestic order and we'd be able to beef up. I think probably this is just beginning to be part of it.
That's unfolding now. We're training people in Bolivia. We're really getting involved in Peru, and we're also talking at the UN about implicating Castro and the Cubans in drug operations and human rights violations as a way of perhaps Castro. Maybe George Bush is going to need another war right before the election because the domestic situation is so terrible. Maybe it's Cuba. But I think to talk about hope at this point in time, Danny, is very important. And let me sort of be the devil's advocate here for a moment. And let me work with your courtroom image that the prosecution presents their case and people almost believe it, and then the people have a chance to speak, or the defendant has a chance to present the case, and the truth comes out. Well, and I like that Richard Nixon image because it's an example of things being able to be turned around. But I covered the Tucson Sanctuary trial for 6 months, and I listened to the prosecution for most of those months, and I was waiting for the other side to have their chance to present. And unfortunately, every time they tried to present the material, the judge sent the jury out of the room and said, that material is unacceptable, in that instance, for the courtroom. Here we have the media now playing judge. This is a new media. This isn't the Richard Nixon media. This is the No More Vietnam media. This is the new media saying, sorry, that is out of order. Jury leaves the room. We being the jury, the American audience. So how is it, Danny, that you're hopeful in the face of this fist clamped down on the flow of information?
Because what it's doing is it is revealing to the American public what the major mainstream media really is. See, that as long as they thought that they were really objective and subtle in kind of inquiring into what was going on in the government, et cetera, then they said, well, if the media isn't telling us anything bad about the government, there must be nothing bad there, because they thought that they were kind of even-handed. There has been an absolute abject display of cheerleading, lack of objectivity, all of that kind of stuff going on now by the media. Even regular people can tell that. And what's happening now is because that media never asked these questions, never looked into the covert operations that were instigating this war, never dealt with any of that stuff. When it starts coming out now, which it will because there are stations like this, and there are alternative media, and there are other channels through which we can get this stuff out now, that we aren't restricted to the major 3 television networks and to the New York Times and the Washington Post. The fact is now that when the American people discover that they've been lied to by the government and that nobody asked the tough questions inside the major media, they're going to say, wait a second, let's give larger contributions to the public radio stations who were trying to ask some of these questions. Let's give some more contributions to these stations, to these alternative news media people. Let's get a look at this kind of thing. Let's get some of this information up on the table here. Let's, instead of relying upon the Justice Department and the special prosecutor, let's give some more contributions to this Cristic Institute. They were the ones telling us. And the thing is that you have to stand with the rain in your face in the bad weather. You have to be the one that people knows was saying that. And you have to be held up to the public ridicule.
Well, it is true. Public radio, we here at KPFK and all the other stations and other public stations around the country were deluged during our last fund drives. They were very successful.
That's
People
right.
coming forward wanting to be involved again.
That's right.
And I am rather heartened at the fact that 2 minutes of video could have such an incredible impact when the people see the truth, as they did in the case of Rodney King and this pounding that this man in Los Angeles received. We got national attention. We have the chief of police who has said some of the most repulsive things for the 12 years that he's been in power in this city. He's been able to get away, and again we've heard about violations like the ones that happened here. But here we've got 2 minutes of video. The American people see the public, and the American people respond. And,
That's right.
And I'm hoping, I don't think we've convinced Dennis yet. Dennis doesn't look happy
because
yet.
we're not over yet. What I'm saying is that the failure of the American major news media to communicate this information to them is going to be perceived by the American people as an act of betrayal. Because they have been taught ever since they've been in the first grade that the media is kind of the fourth estate. They're the ones that are supposed to ask these questions for them, that they've actually been lulled into complete passivity, that you just sit back and any questions that need to get asked will be asked by Woodward and Bernstein, or they'll be asked by, Daniel Shore or something. They say that to them. Well, the fact is that those questions weren't asked and they weren't dealt with. And now, for example, the Cristic Institute has just Monday sent out a paper. We sent it out a weekend earlier to some of the media people to detail the kind of criminal covert operations that were involved. For example, that Oliver North and Richard Secord and Albert Hakim's enterprise, they have entries right in Oliver North's notebooks about Sarkis Saganalian working with Richard Secord and Albert Hakim in supplying to Iraq $50 billion of military equipment during the 1980s. $50 billion, and when it was completely criminal. It was just as illegal to sell them that military equipment as it was for the enterprise to sell the TOW missiles to Iraq. And you're dealing with a criminal conspiracy here, and the same one that they've already been told about in the Iran-Contra scandal. It's the exact same men. And they're seeing that and that's going to happen. We sent the information out. We sent it to them. And when I arrived in San Diego on Saturday night and got ready to do a talk there Sunday in the opinion section of the San Diego Union, not exactly a liberal paper, is a huge opinion section saying, now is the time to ask the questions. Was this a right war? Was this war necessary? Was this war choreographed? I went on a radio show yesterday in San Diego with a woman who used to work for Pat Robertson. We're talking, again, not a liberal person down there. And by the end of that show, she was livid over what had happened because she'd been so taken in. And that's the kind of thing you're going to start to see. You're going to see the people ask the questions. You're going to see the people know that they've been hoodwinked by this thing. And because they were so seriously misled, because they were so seriously indulged in this kind of euphoria, they're going to feel betrayed. Now that's what's getting ready to happen. Now the question is, what is the mechanism by means of which this is going to be done? And I think that the alternative media, the radio and the print media, the alternatives, some cable television, videotapes, to send the videotapes around. The Cristic Institute and others have videotapes detailing this stuff that are going to be made available to people now. And very important, I think a second extraordinarily important lesson has come. If people don't realize now how absolutely and totally bankrupt the Democratic Party is, they're never going to know the lesson. To see the Democratic Party have done what it did and to fawn around and not challenge these people and not really press their position on this thing and to then kowtow to this thing, say, well, looks like the president's going to do this anyhow. He told us he's going to do it without us. We can't impeach him just because he's defying the Constitution. He's kind of a popular guy. And then to fawn around and let this war go on the way that it did and not do anything to really stop this thing and not have the courage to ask any of these questions themselves. They won't in the midst of all of this flood of yellow ribbons, none of them will get up and start asking these questions, will not demand to know the answers. When the White House won't allow April Gillespie to go before the Foreign Affairs Committee, they won't compel her. They won't issue any subpoenas for her. They won't make John Kelly come in there and answer the questions of why he was sending these kind of signals to Saddam Hussein. They won't dare do this.
And indeed, when the 68 votes came down in the Congress,
Yeah.
50 of those votes, they actually said, we're not voting for this war, but
That's
we're
right.
going to vote to support our president.
That's right.
And this idea that there would be that many Democrats who would be wanting to support
That's right.
George Bush.
But both of those institutions, Dennis, just let me close on this point, and then we can dialogue about it, is that only until such time as the American people reject the ABC Evening News and CBS and NBC as their sources of truth, and only until such time as they reject the Democratic Party as their avenue to solutions, will there be any realistic chance of getting some really significant changes going on here. And that's why the time has come very close now for the establishment of a new independent political party. That is what is going on now. There are major meetings going on now about it. There's an entire generation here that born between 1945 at the end of that war and before the president was assassinated in 1963, President Kennedy, that one baby boom generated 75 million American citizens, and that we constitute 44.7% of the entire potential electorate. In every single year now, a sign of hope is every single entering class now coming in the freshman year of college, coming out of high school at 18 years of age now, is asking to talk to the 60s people. Let's talk to the 60s people. Let's organize against apartheid in South Africa. Let's get this thing going. See, we are gaining a new entering class every single year. And the World War II generation is losing people to old age every single year. And they're going down and down and down. And what you see is a desperate effort on their part to cling to old images, to old views of the world.
To old world orders?
To old world orders. And that what we're seeing here, in a sense, is a sign of a last gasp. Now, I would like to just in this context bring to the image the season that we're in. Of the spring equinox, the recycling of life, the coming back to life, the Easter celebration, and the Passover, because a people wander in the desert for a number of years does not mean that they're lost, that their day is gone. That the fact is that is a toughening experience. That is in the same way that when you believe that your hopes have been crucified, when the entire movement has been crucified upon a cross of yellow ribbon, that only then will people feel adequately despondent to say, it is time for me to get off my butt. It is time for me to get back into what I was doing in the 60s. It's time for me to get back into telling my kids about what's really got to get done now. It's time to get over this lethargy, that the kind of stunning example that we have seen of just international imperialist ventures that have just gone down now does not escape an entire generation. We know what that is. We've seen that before. And it took, and to relive a little history here, it took a lot more than we would like to remember that it took to get us into action back in the 1960s. The fact is the 60s took place not from 60 to 70, but from 65 to 75. We were out, those of us who were the cutting edge, the beginning of the World War II post-baby boom generation, 2 or 3 years we were in college, kind of lugging around and kind of not knowing what was going on. It took a few years to grasp how awful things were, and that's now done. That our entire generation, I think, now knows what's happened here. And no matter where you go, people say, well, it doesn't mean that all the entire 44.7% are going to vote your way because they've gotten jobs, 2.3 kids, they're all working here. The fact is, we are not the yuppie generation. We aren't yuppies. We didn't convert to yuppies. We got into having kids and doing the other stuff that people do normally. But the fact is that the yuppies are beneath us. They're younger than us. They're the 30-year-olds down to the 20-year-olds. It's the people below 20 years old now and the people that are 30 to 45. There's where your power is, right in that block. And that's the people that have to be organized. And we have the 501c3 public interest groups who can articulate positive visions, not just criticizing the Republicans and Democrats and say, oh, this is what's wrong with the Republican Clean Air Act and this is what's wrong with the Democratic Clean Air Act. We know what a Clean Air Act should look like. We know what the details are. We know how much it's going to cost. We know where the tax money should come from. And the same way with the Equal Rights Amendment in the feminist issues. We know what those are. We don't have to just sit and carp at these World War II generation people The time has passed. The time has passed for this generation to be going to these people like we go to our father on Friday night and ask them for the car keys. We have grown up now, and that we are in charge. We're grown up. We're adults. It's time for us to realize that we've now grown up. It's time to take control in this country.
I'm glad you didn't say a third party as opposed to an independent party.
It's an independent party.
There's only one party now with two names.
Yes.
And it's important
to keep
independent
that in mind.
Party.
Yes.
There really is only one party, and it's really irrelevant, ultimately, Democrat, Republican.
That's right.
They do work together on issues. We saw this happen. We saw the most liberal of Democrats, some of the most liberal of Democrats, like Barbara Boxer, up from where I come from, do an amazing flip-flop in a very short period of time. You're wrong, Pam. I am convinced. I am hopeful. And I think it's important for us to talk about your image and to, if I could just make your point, hammer it home, your point about that footage, that 2 minutes of footage that has now taken on a crummy little video camera that most people or many people have, that 2 minutes of footage shown nationally has now created a situation in which generally the American people feel that the police in this country brutalize people. That is what 2 minutes of footage can do prime time. So just to carry that image a little bit further, just imagine if we just got 3 minutes of truth about the war every night, just 3 minutes of truth, 3 minutes of equivalent. The footage that we would have seen if it was real about the war would have made that footage that we saw about police brutality light and mild. Can you imagine every night American population watched Dan Rather broadcast footage in which, say, 5,000 people are incinerated on the spot. Brown bodies, little babies. We know because we've got reports out of Jordan where they saw the videotape of the shelter where it was utter chaos in the streets when people saw the little babies coming out, crisp and burnt from U.S. bombing missions. So I really am hopeful that if the information gets out to the American people, they will be changed. And I think, Danny, that's why the networks took such risks in shutting down John Alpert and Marianne DeLeo, who will be talking about Friday night at the benefit for KPFK at the Robert Frost Auditorium, I guess it is. We're going to be talking about how nervous the networks were. We have filmmakers who won 7 Emmy Awards, DuPont Awards, 7 Emmys. They won NBC 7 Emmys. They did over 100 broadcasts for NBC. NBC knew who these people were. They had been in Vietnam, in Cambodia, in the Soviet Union. They had been in El Salvador, in Guatemala, for the network, for NBC, winning them Emmy Awards. They came back. Brokaw, and whatever you think about him, Brokaw and Steve Friedman, the executive producer of NBC News, said, yes, this is a scoop. We want it. What did they have? They had footage on the ground in Iraq the first week in February at the height of the air war that demonstrated, by the way, they had uncensored footage, the only uncensored footage to come out. They had it. It demonstrated a great conflict between what was really going on and what the U.S. military was saying. It was accepted, and then it was killed from the top by the president of NBC News, who said, I haven't seen it. I'm sure it's very good, but I just don't want to be involved with freelancers anymore. That's what this meant. And he said,
CBS didn't
And he said, I don't also want to be associated with the Ramsey Clarks of the world, former attorney general, highest law enforcement person in the land, son of a Supreme Court justice, not your typical radical. They went to CBS because they weren't going to give up, and Tom Bettag of CBS said, sure, we like this stuff. This is a scoop. We're going to go for it. And Bettag said, yep, you're going to be on tomorrow night with Dan Rather. Well, they went home, started to prepare their footage without Ramsey Clark. They wanted the footage without Ramsey Clark, who was on the trip. And they got a call in the middle of the night. Tom Bettag lost his job, and their footage was canceled. By the way, when they came home, Japanese television bought it in a minute and put it right on. Mm-hmm. So if that footage was shown, perhaps we would have had a different point of view.
But that will be shown, you see, because
it will be.
What's going to happen now, what people need to understand is that they need to do it, that people need to do this. That we can no longer be passive about this. We can't sit around wringing our hands in bemoaning the premature death of the movement. The fact is that in the same way that the Cristic Institute was declared dead when people thought that Judge King had thrown out the Lepenka case, just last week we got through arguing in front of the Court of Appeals, and this case is going to be going back into discovery. And by May, we'll have a decision in our favor. We'll be back in subpoenaing these people. Those people are going to be brought to justice, just the same way that it took 10 years to get the Karen Silkwood case won all the way to the Supreme Court. This is going to take some time. But the thing about the 60s generation is that we do not quit. We do not quit. They're not going to roll over. We're not going to roll over and stop. This thing is going to come to pass now, that we are going to have to take charge ourselves. We're going to have to organize a new independent political party. We have to support our independent radio stations. We're going to have to do more active and creative videotaping and set up distribution networks to distribute that stuff around the world and around the country. We're going to have our own independent sources of communication.
And it will work.
It will work.
Before I left San Francisco, that videotape was shown at a church. When I walked into the church, I was to introduce this tape. And I looked at the church and I said, this is ridiculous. Why did they get such a huge church? I'm going to be here with 30 people. Well, 1,500 people showed up to look at that videotape, and they had to turn away 200 people. And I know that the 1,500 people who saw that videotape were angry and were out the next morning calling the networks and calling NBC and complaining and saying, why haven't you done it? And you're right, Danny, that's what it's about. It's not going to be crushed. If people in this audience want to see that videotape, they're probably going to have a chance Friday night. If they want to hear about censored material, they should pay attention to Daniel Sheehan, the Cristic Institute, the alternative media, and the people, not just us, Danny Sheehan, Dennis Bernstein, Pam Burton, but the people, everybody has to become a very active, pro-peace expert.
Because that's how we got here. We didn't start out this way. That you need to take that first step. You need to step out and say, I'm not just going to rely upon the Cristic Institute to do my job for me. I'm going to ask them for the information. I'm going to get the data, and then I'm going to invite my friends to my house. And I'm going to show them the videotape. I'm going to talk with them about that. And people have to become active. The key concept of the Constitution, which is the Bill of Rights, 200 years old this year. The celebration of the 200th anniversary of the final process of that Constitution is right this year. And the most primary concept was that the people ourselves have to ever be vigilant, that we have to be active, we have to do our work for ourselves. That's the reason you go to school. That's the reason you get educated. That's the reason you read books, is you got to get busy. The bottom line is you have to retake this country for the American people, to take it out of the hands of the George Bushes and these corporate moguls. You got to take it back, and you do it through democratic processes, through all kinds of education and street organizing, and to get busy, get back in. Let me tell you, it's not, people say, are the 60s going to come back? No, the 90s are coming.
The upside-down 60s. They're here.
The 21st century.
Get ready to stand on your head.
We're going to make them available to people. If you want the stories we wrote about the documents, if you want the documents so that you can shake it in the face of one news director or another, we'll provide it for you. We can make copies. We have access to computers, copy machines, the whole bit. Just like the other side uses technology, we can use it for peaceful means.
And to quote something that John Stockwell wrote about in his new book, The Praetorian Guard, remember that those who do not do politics will be done. Thank you so much for being my guest today. Again, Dennis Bernstein from Pacific News Service and KPFK in Berkeley, and also Daniel Sheehan of the Cristic Institute.
Thanks.
Thank you, Pamela.